Hi, I'm Dr. Wayne Phillips. I am a native of Tampa, Florida, and a member of St. Brendan's Parish for almost 30 years with my wife, Bridget. Today I'm presenting for you 15 minutes of the Shroud of Turin to whet your appetite and get into more detail. So why am I doing it? Because I feel our faith is under attack by the secular world, and we have to defend it. So I use the science of the secular world to try to defend our faith and protect our youth. So let's get started. So for the first time in history, what I really feel and believe, the whole purpose of my ministry, is the fact that I believe as a doctor, a physician talking to you as a patient, is that history and science has caught up with our faith. And I think we almost have 100% scientific proof of the resurrection when we talk about the data on the shroud. So let me get to the end of the talk and forget to tell you, however, about the one missing link that we may never have. So we have a conflict here. It's obvious. The Shroud of Turin is either the witness to the resurrection or it's a medieval fraud. So I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes trying to show you just a little taste of what that data shows. So what you don't hear is what I'm going to tell you today. So you always hear the History Channel talks about the Shroud, Discovery Channel, National Geographic. This has all been going on since 1975. But what I'm going to tell you now is what they don't tell you. The things that secular world leaves out that gets a little too close of showing that the Shroud is the real deal. So this is a position that the Shroud shows us of the burial of Jesus Christ. Typical Jewish burial. So first of all, the man of the Shroud is nude, which would be very unusual for a medieval forger to choose to do that depiction. He's lied down on the shroud, the base of it, on top of some rock formation. And what's important is that one piece of shroud, 14 feet long, is curled around his head, and the top portion of the shroud touches the top of his body, and the bottom portion of the shroud touches the base. So what we have now is the actual shroud. My wife and I were in Turin, Italy during the exhibition of 2015, and we can see from this, it's a little bit hard to see, but we can see the head of a man, we can see the back of his head, the front of his head, his chest, we can see his arms, his crossed hands, his knees, we can see his back, we can see what seems to be a lot of marks on his back, long parts of his legs may be flexed, and burn marks all the way through, because the shroud for 2,000 years has always been under attack. Now, what is important here? Pretty simple. There are three basic physical facts. This is a high-quality linen cloth with a weave compatible for the first century style. So Joseph Arimathea, being a very rich member of the Sanhedrin, fits this quality of cloth. He easily could have owned this. The cloth is covered in blood in unique locations, and most important of all, has an image on it. The image is unparalleled by any old cloth in existence. There is no other image of any proportion of this delicate construction and detail in existence. And most important, all the naysayers of the Shroud of Turin as being a fake cannot duplicate this image. In fact, all the science we have cannot duplicate the image. So right now it resides in Turin, Italy, in the cathedral, St. John the Baptist Cathedral, where about every 15 to 20 years it's under exhibition. It is willed to the Pope, so the Pope has not been the owner until 1983. The kings of Savoy, one succession after another, over 450 years, exactly were the owners. Right now it's in a bomb-proof steel case. It has an argon atmosphere and hopefully will never be attacked. So when does the science begin? The science actually begins in 1898 when Segundo Pia, an attorney, part-time photographer in Turin, Italy, took the picture of the shroud. So in 1898, the picture kind of impressed everyone because it was odd. The man himself, his body was dark and the background was light. So those of you who are old enough to remember photonegativity and photopositivity, the features of this picture on the shroud, this image on the shroud, has all the characteristics of a photographic negative. So in the dark room, Segundo Pia made a negative of a negative, and he astounded the world with a find of a photopositive. This is the photopositive. This was in the newspapers of the time, spread all over the world, and really was unusual because now the man comes alive. The details can be seen very dramatically. The sockets of his eyes are set in. You can see his nose. You can see mustache. You can see beard, actually maybe even a plucked beard. You can see long, scraggly hair. And kind of odd, there's blood in his hair, but none on his cheeks, which I'll explain later. And you can see blood all over the top of his scalp and a curious 3 in the folds of his forehead. So the first thing to say, if this was done by a medieval artist and is a fake, it's quite impressive because photography, photo positive and negative, was not even discovered till 1818. The carbon dating says this exists in 1250. That's impossible. So the medieval date by carbon dating would have to be 448 years before photography. Somebody invented photography to have a photo positive, knowing that in the future, if it was put under a negative, it would be a photo negative, which is, of course, is impossible. In 1931, better cameras now were invented. You can see much more detail of the entire body of the man of the shroud. Again, you can see the detailed blood in the hair, and most important to remember now, which you don't hear on CNN and the secular world, the man of the shroud has no cheeks and no ears. And that would be very hard to understand as happening by just an artist. But that is true, and I'm going to tell you why. There's scarred marks all over his chest. There's a right-sided wound. We'll show you the details of that. There's blood flowing down his arm in a very undisturbed, pristine state. And the nail in the wrist can be seen, which we're going to talk about in detail later. And here we are again, a sample of no thumbs, no ears, and no cheeks. The back part shows a ponytail, the typical appearance of the Jewish person, scalp blood, scourge marks all over his back, blood and water leaking across his back, knees bent, and of course he's nude. 78 years later was the next thing that happened from the first photo that we talked about. 1976, 20th century science actually begins. Ironically, why does it happen? It happens because Sandia Corporation, the inventor and help maker of the atomic bomb, teamed up with NASA and developed what was called a VP8 image analyzer. That was a camera and a computer, and it was put in satellites that went around the moon. That picked up data from the top of a mountain on the moon, and the top of the mountain, of course, would reflect light and be brighter than as you go down the side of the mountain, it would lose its brightness. So this was used to calculate the height of a mountain. So what that did astounded the world when it was applied by Dr. John Jackson in 1976, professor of physics at the U.S. Air Force Academy, and put inside the VP8 image analyzer. 3D image popped out of the image analyzer. So not only was this a photo negative, but it's a 3D encoded image. So that medieval artist who faked this image got a lot smarter, because not only was he 400 years ahead in photography, he also knew about 3D, and he also knew that we would figure out 3D 1,500 years later. So this allowed Pope Paul VI to be impressed. And what was he impressed with? American science. He knew now that he could trust someone to touch the shroud. So the first human beings on Earth to ever do a scientific study were, I'm proud to say, from America. 400 independent scientists from NASA, Los Alamos, Lockheed, IBM, U.S. Air Force Academy, all got together, went over for Turin, Italy for 5 days, and they represented all these disciplines of science. This is a picture of the leaders, Ray Rogers, John Jackson, the local Italian Professor Riggi, all doing their work, and actually under looking at the back of the shroud with a scope that had none of this area had been seen in over 600 years. So, what did this STURP team found? Well, I'm an allergist, so this impressed me right off the top. They found on it pollen unique to Jerusalem, 3 actual types of pollen that only exist in Jerusalem, 14 types that are unique to Israel, and 58 types that were in Istanbul, France, and Turkey, which is where we think the shroud actually took its travels. But of course, all this had to be faked by the medieval forger, who 400 years ago could figure this out, what the pollen was looking like, and identify it without a microscope. Later, when they took some of the blood back to the United States to examine it, it was definitely proven to be human blood, blood type AB, and little editorializing for me, that's universal receiver. A little hint, I think Jesus could be put in that category. And it had primate blood, but only the S marker. The S marker is human, so the people did not use monkey blood on the shroud. When they got a microscope out and looked at the image itself had nothing on it. These are fibers, and in that are fibrils, which make up fibers, little blood at the bottom. There's no paint, dye, or any type of drawing touching those fibers. So what did the STURP team prove? It proved the image is not a painting, not a drawing, not a rubbing, not a scorching, not a photograph, and not a bleaching. So that medieval forger, that genius forger, and this is what CNN never tells you, had to know how to create a photonegative image, how to create a 3D image, had to use Jerusalem-specific pollen, had to create an image without paint or dye, used human blood, not monkey blood. So, STURP then went on to prove what the image is. What the image is simply, I can try to explain it in a second, actually a burn of the surface, but in a pixelated fashion. Perpendicular, pixelated points of burning that put together cause an image for our brain to pick up. The top surface of a single linden fiber is affected, so in a whole fiber, that energy that came out of that body was so well controlled that our brains cannot put a wrap around that. That means matter turned into energy in a controlled fashion, not a nuclear explosion. And the radiation that came out, which we think is X-ray laser light type quality, burned only the surface and left an image everywhere. The top 1% of fibers. It's so simple it can be scraped off. Now, interesting is, how does the shroud back up the gospel? We read about the suffering of Jesus and all the proponents of the crucifixion and on the way to the cross. We have evidence on the shroud. So there's evidence all over the shroud's face of a man who was facially beaten, a broken nose. He was scourged, over 120 in the front, 200 and some scourge marks in the back. There's a crown of thorns. Well, I put it in yellow because it's not quite a crown. There are nails in the wrist, not necessarily in the palm, I'm going to explain that, and the feet, a lance in the side. So it almost exactly, scientifically, according to the shroud, matches the Bible. Here's an example. These are the 120 scourge marks. This is the Roman flagrum that was used to make this. This is a dumbbell led on a leather strap, and the Passion of the Christ was fairly accurate, the way that would gouge into the skin and make all these holes. And the crown of thorns actually could not have been a real crown with basket weaving and shaping. It had to be just a clump of thorns smacked on his head, and there's evidence of that because there's pinholes and marks with the sharp points everywhere on the top of his head. The plant we think is guilty of this is the Gundelia terniforti, because there's pollen all over around the head of Gundelia terniforti that exists in Jerusalem. The next point is what we're used to seeing is the palm of the hand. We're used to seeing the nail in the palm of the hand. This is an artist's perception, but science says you cannot crucify a person and hold up 80 pounds or 90 pounds of weight by a nail in the palm of the hand. This would just rip through the flesh. So actually the shroud backs that up. The shroud shows the scientific fact that the man of the shroud was crucified with a nail in his wrist. So this is the fingers, this is the palm of the hand, this is the wrist. So that nail was in his wrist, not to support him. Now, when it goes into this position of the wrist, it bisects the median nerve, it damages it. That nerve controls the muscles of the thumb. So the muscles of the thumb go into spasm, and that spasm puts that thumb here in the middle of the palm of the hand, bending around. That's why it doesn't show up on the image. This is Dr. Barbet, was his opinion on the position of the nail. So on the shroud we have more backup. This is a better picture showing the hands and no thumb, and the hands and no thumb, and the nail in the wrist. So what we have is way more facts than I have time in this little short 15-minute presentation, but it should whet your appetite. There's over 100 facts published in scientific journals showing the shroud is the authentic truth. Now, John Paul II, St. John Paul II, gave permission in 1988 for the shroud to have carbon dating. This is where we got a little messed up. So the carbon dating was published in all the papers of the world in 1988 that it was shown to be a fake. Carbon dating said it was 1290 to 1370, 1260 to 1390. Well, no research was done by any of the shroud team or any of the other countries on the shroud for almost 13 years. And the believing people, the people with faith, still would not give up the fact that the shroud was fake, because I had just seen all the other details that I showed you. So in that middle of the lunatic fringe, which the scientist calls those believers, Sue Benford arises, a nurse with no background in the Catholic faith, no background maybe even in Christianity, and she sits there and wonders why that could be wrong when she just heard all the other facts that the shroud is authentic. So here's what she looked at. She asked for a photograph taken from this team that actually did the sampling. This is a photograph of the piece of the shroud that was cut out for the C14 sampling. She noticed this misaligned weave in 2001 and then actually published in 2008. So these are her little black lines put in. So the only person on earth to notice this first was Sue. This is now linen, which is normal shroud material, with a reweaving meshing in perfectly with cotton from the years 1600s and 1500s. So when you burn this down and mix it together, it certainly doesn't come out dirty. It comes out 1270 to 1360. Here's a close-up. You can see how pristine and beautiful these rectangles are of fine linen, the white color, versus the shragged, beat-up place of the cotton. So that was thought then in her theory that the international protocol that took 2 years of all the countries in the world to agree on, they agreed on 6 sample sites, 6 labs. All that was violated because the Turin scientists decided to do it on their own, the sampling of the C14 in secret. The United States was not invited to show up, and they decided after yelling at each other for almost 2 hours that they were only going to do 1 sample site, and they were going to send it to 3 labs. So they took that sample site from the worst position they could possibly do in a 14-foot long cloth. Remember, this is only half of it. The other half is the back image. So this is the area where they chose, where also repairs had been done in the past. So they took this piece out here, and that is where we think there was extra reweaving, and the sample was never taken, so the shroud has never had carbon dating. So Ray Rogers from 2001 to 2005, when the original shroud chemist did his test doing pyrolysis spectrometry, microscopy, microchemical analysis, and published in 2005 that the shroud was a victim of reweaving. The carbon-14 was fake. Actually, I should use the word fake, but that's another discussion. So in it, he had samples that he showed where linen was glued together at the end of cotton. That's a single thread of cotton touching a thread of linen. This is a thread of cotton, which is not supposed to be in a linen shroud, covered in dye. It would make white cotton start looking yellow and match the color of the shroud. So the conclusions in 2005, the C14 labs were accurate. They were innocent. It's the old axiom, garbage in, garbage out. So they were given flawed material. Now, in July of 2019, the raw data from the carbon dating in one of the carbon dating labs was forced by lawsuit to be released, and it proved that that section I showed you, that rectangle, had different dates from left to right. In a 3-inch space, the date changed. A reweaving was responsible for the error. So this made enthusiasm come back with all the shroud scientists, and I'm going to show you quickly some of the new discoveries. So now we have the best hypothesis in 2020 on how the image happened during the resurrection through the knowledge of physics and science at this part in our evolution. So we think that during image formation, the body turned into energy. And as the energy, the mass dissipated and turned into energy, the cloth had no solid source to keep it on top of the body. So only the upper cloth fell through the body. The bottom cloth, of course, never moved. It was on a rock. So this is called, by John Jackson, the mechanically transparent. So during this time, the shroud, which is wrapping, now becomes flat and falls through the body as the resurrection takes place, and the body disappears. So from a top view, looking at the top of the head of the man of the shroud starts out here, wrapping his cheeks and his nose, and as dematerialization takes place, it falls through the body. So any blood that was on his cheek gets transferred to the shroud here, but as it falls through the body, it appears that it's moving because the cloth is becoming flat, and the blood appears to be in the hair, but of course it cannot be. So by the time the shroud gets down to this green area, the mass is turning into energy too much, so it's running out of energy. So the projection of excimer light hitting the shroud in a pixelated fashion runs out. Therefore, there's no more mass to create energy to show an ear or show cheeks. And of course, the whole shroud, its entire length, has no sides. So what happened then? These series all require a miracle. This did not happen by any way any man will ever be able to do or figure out in its entirety. The body dematerialized. The reverse, E equals mc squared. It's an atomic explosion without blowing up Jerusalem. So what have I just shown you? I have shown you that me as a physician talking to you, and I don't lie to my patients, has 100% scientific evidence that a dead human body was in the shroud. A dead human body did not move in the shroud. A dead human body affected an image on the shroud. We do not have 100% evidence the body was Jesus, but we have 3 unique details of Jesus' crucifixion that no other man has ever been recorded to have suffered: scourging, crown of thorns, lance on the side. Now, the little point I mentioned before, we will never have 100% proof. There is always room for faith, because we will never have 100% evidence of Jesus Christ being the shroud person, because it requires freshly donated DNA sample from a living Jesus sitting in the lab, then matching that DNA to the shroud DNA. So my opinion, what is the shroud for? It's to help us protect the faith of many different groups of people. It is science to show me people have to see things. The secular world makes that happen. This is for our youth to refer to when their faith is questioned in college, to do a good fight at 3 a.m. to all the non-believers. It's for the over 30s to return them to our faith, because now there's science to show Jesus is real and the resurrection is scientifically accurate, and it's to bring all people to faith who have an open mind. And this is all with the help of the first selfie. Thank you very much. So I hope this has whet your appetite on the science of the shroud and will lead you to look for more sources at shroud.com. It is certainly a wonderful subject to know about and will help us defend our faith. God bless you.